All right, everybody, what are we, week 5, I think, of our inaccessible work? So last week we were doing the squish hide behind flat stuff that's pushed up against a wall. These are super common, and like you see them a lot behind stacks of chairs or behind racks of tables, or like in conference centers where things are pushed up against the wall. I've seen them put behind like bureaus or big pieces of furniture. They all work the same way. They kind of smash the odor and shoot it out both sides. I want to look at a couple of examples of some really nice work. So here we have an exterior. It's whoops. I don't know what's going on. Can you still see my screen? So here we have an exterior. It's behind this pallet situation here. And we have wind. She's starting from an upwind perspective, which we know when you start from an upwind zone, the dog has minimal odor available to it. So it's not surprising that as she gets to the downwind side, that the dog starts working and navigating the scent cone and is reluctant to come back over here. If there's no information over here about the problem that the dog is working, the dog's not going to pursue that, unlikely, unless they have a whole lot of like maze experience. We did mazes at the last semi-private and saw kind of how hard it is for the dog to find an opening that is in an upwind position of the odor cone. So, you know, if the dog has a lot of experience like that, they may find it easier to bring themselves into an area with less odor.
Nope.
So as she gets downwind, we'll kind of look at that a little bit closer. As she gets downwind, you can see on the line here that she's active. She's going to come over here. She's going to get just to where the information stops and then goes back to that access point that she's picking up. This is behind the table here. So we have a lot of information coming from here. We have a lot of information. We have a lot of sniffing. She's looking for source. Expanding. Remember I said that odor is going to squish and push in both directions. And you kind of want to feel that moment that, like, when do you feel like you want to move the table for the dog? Because that's your payment point. Think about the feeling like when you're interpreting the dog's behavior for a birdie barrier, when do you want to move it? So there's her possession. I don't know if you guys saw that, but just the back feet there. Watch the back feet right there. So we get kind of a little mini decision for her, but it's so diffused and so inaccessible that it's not the kind of possession that we're used to seeing. And this is sometimes what we see in trial pictures. And not only does it eat up a lot of time, but it leaves the handler feeling really uncertain about what to call. So the more we can kind of see these pictures and more feel them. So there's that. And then we looked at her birdie barriers, and I was commenting about how the drive is a good thing. This is why sometimes when you have a slightly obnoxious dog on birdie barriers, it turns into a good thing in real pictures. because you get this lovely drive and this lovely push into spaces. This one I love because you can really see how far that odor squishes out from the location. So she's going up the stairs. She works this edge, this corner over here a little bit as well. And there's that kind of that push again, where might be obnoxious in a birdie barrier scenario. The reality is this is going to be a much more realistic picture to what you're going to have to read. And if the dog is that kind of pushy and insistent, it's a lot easier to read that. So paired birdie barriers for the win there. Questions about last week about the squish? Okay. This week we're going to combine elements. So one of the things that I really want you to think about or to watch for is any indication from your dog that the picture we're asking them about might be a little bit confusing. Not that they can't work through it, but just that something about it stumps them just a little bit. We've been talking about this a lot in the lounge. I've been talking about it a lot in the semi-privates. So keep your eyes peeled for indications that the dog might be confused. What might that look like? Might look like an extended ground sniff. Might look like a stop and scratch. It might look like a stop and self-groom. It might look like an elaborate shake-off. It might look like the dog stopping and staring at you for a moment and asking questions. It might look like the dog speeding up and running circles. I'm looking at Roxy. You know, like that, those dogs that like go high, they need a place to put that energy when they're a little bit frustrated, and sometimes out is where that energy goes. So if you notice a speed pickup or the dog starting to do even circles where they're not really searching, they're just moving, it's often a signal that whatever has been put in front of them or whatever you're doing is a little bit confusing. So let's examine what we're doing. Are you on leash? Are you a little bit closer than you normally are? Is the leash taut? Is the leash slacking and going taut at unpredictable moments? Are you in the dog's way quite often? You know, all of these things can leave the dog kind of scratching their heads and saying, did you mean to do that? Or are you just being a buffoon and you're in the way? You know, like, I don't think the dogs totally understand when sometimes we intend to do something different for a training exercise or for, you know, an attempt to help them solve a problem. And when we're just in the way, because we're in the way a lot. So all of those things might lead to a head scratching moment. And what I want you to consider is, say you're putting this picture in front of the dog and the dog has an elaborate like stop and scratch moment. You should think to yourself, okay, noted. This was a little confusing for you. I'm not sure what element of it was a little bit confusing for you, but something about it was confusing. Finish what you're doing. It doesn't necessarily mean, oh, my dog's stopping and scratching, I will stop the search right now. That's not helping the dog be resilient to confusion, but it should guide the next thing you do. So the next setup that you do should support the dog and help the dog feel better about the experience that they're having. If we confuse the dog and we're not aware that we've confused the dog, and then we put in front of them a secondary experience without making adjustments, without adding pairing to the picture, without maybe making more distance between the two hides, without maybe making the inaccessible less inaccessible, maybe doing a maze instead of an inaccessible hide. There's all kinds of ways you can tweak the concept and get the same idea through to the dog, but in a way that they can kind of be supported through it. The challenge this week is to put out an inaccessible and a sourceable hide, because this is realistically where we're going. Next week, we're going to add more baselines. So I want to make sure they can do one baseline, a candy hide. It can be something that just makes them feel good, but make your inaccessible kind of like you did this last week, where it was challenging. Or maybe you want to run the engine block hide again. Maybe this is a nice experience to say, hey, can you do the engine block hide with something else in the space? I know the next question is going to be, well, how far apart should these things be? And it's hard for me to answer that question because each of your dog is an individual, and this is where you need to kind of step up and be the trainer. This is not a close hide question that we're asking the dogs. It's a, can you pay attention equally to something that is completely available and makes you feel good, and to something that is a little less obvious in whatever manner you set that up to be? It should be something the dog has seen before in some capacity, like you could duplicate one of the problems that you set in front of them this week or do something similar. So don't do something so like batshit crazy that they can't solve it. They should have seen it before. It's not a close hide exercise. That's what we're trying to get. Can you pay attention to sourceable odor as well as diffused odor in the same kind of picture? Options for you. You could work this as zones. You could easily set up a first zone with your inaccessible hide and then allow access to your sourceable hide. It gets the, it's like, it's a way of breaking it down, because I'm not saying I'm confronting you with both of these things right off the bat. I'm saying I'm going to help you by providing a little bit of delineation between the two challenges. And then if that goes really well, say the dog hits the inaccessible, solves it without looking for something easier, and then you allow access to the sourceable and they solve that one, great. Great. Now maybe my next step is to eliminate the delineation between the two, the door or the gate or whatever's separating the spaces. That's the way I can break it down. I could certainly pair both of them. I could certainly pair the inaccessible if I think that's going to be the tricky one. I could allow more space if my dog does better in situations where she's not going to catch the sourceable hide from the inaccessible. I could use space to help her by adding space between the two problems. On the flip side, if my dog gets stressed out because of non-productive space, I want to shorten that space. Does that make sense? It's really about honing into the things that your dog, to the behaviors that your dog is showing you, and then letting that drive your next step. What aid am I going to put in for my next step? What aid am I going to take away from my next step? And maybe the next step happens the next day. Maybe you find that your dog needs some latent learning to kind of really solidify ideas, and your next step doesn't happen for 3 days after that. All of that is fine, and it's very dog driven. So if you need help kind of deciding how to set this up for your dog, reach out, like, post in the group, post on your thread, message me. It's all good. Like I have found, as long as I can do whatever it is from my phone, I'm rather responsive to all of the questions. Kathy will attest to that. Right, but this is important. You are the trainer of your dog. So setting up good problems for them to learn from and knowing how to do that is important. And that's what I'm here for.
Michelle, ideally, do we want them to encounter and solve the inaccessible and then essentially reward themselves with the easier one? Or is it really not relevant which one they choose to work and solve first?
I think I would be happy, like if it was my dog and I was doing this exercise, I would be happy if they just engaged the problems in whatever way that they caught them.
Okay.
So I would like either to see like the dog come through, catch odor from the inaccessible, negotiate the inaccessible, get a payment point, and then be released to the sourceable, or vice versa. They come in, they whip around on the sourceable, boom. It's a different question that you're asking, but it's kind of in the same vein. I don't think that one is better than the other. They need to be able to do both. What is not, or what is less productive, is if the dog comes in, notices the inaccessible, works it a little bit, you either wait too long for a payment point or the dog gets frustrated with the problem, abandons it, goes and self-rewards on the sourceable hide, and then one of two things is going to happen. Either the dog is going to say, oh, great, now the inaccessible makes more sense to me, and they're going to go back there to negotiate it, and you better take that because that's a big deal. Or they're going to say, I didn't like that problem. I didn't understand that problem. That problem didn't make me feel good. I'm going to go look for another one of these. And they're going to search the rest of the space, whatever their space is, for the problems that make them feel good.
Okay.
But as far as which one's first, I don't think it matters. And I would be perfectly happy if the dog needed to put the inaccessible on hold to go do the sourceable and then come back, as long as they come back. And they've not like dismissed it for eternity and, you know, kind of said, this one sucks. I'm not going to deal with that one. Okay. All right, everybody. Week 5, so week 6 is next week. This is when we start to think about what topics we want to do for the next one. So put your thinking caps on. All right, everybody. I will see you next week.
Thanks.
Good night.